Good morning, everyone, and we're absolutely delighted to have so many of you join us again this morning for the second in our two-part expert webinars in HR, looking at impending HR challenges. Today, we're looking specifically at the area of HR planning and restructuring for the off-season. As an industry, we do recognise that it's never been as challenging a position for us in trying to navigate so many hurdles. And we in Fudge Ireland are delighted to be able to go some way towards supporting you to have the necessary information and guidance you need in light of what is facing you looking at organisational restructuring requirements for the off-season. With such a positive response to our question polls in our last webinar, we're going to once again be inviting you at various points to actually get involved in the discussion through our question polls to ensure you feel engaged and have the opportunity to really sense check where you're at in your planning process against industry colleagues participating on the webinar. So with that in mind, I suppose, Colette, we'll invite maybe the first poll of today before we kick off and before I introduce Caroline. And that first question is, have you completed business forecasting and cash flow projections at this point for the coming 3 to 6 months to inform staffing levels? So just to gauge where you're at in that planning process as we speak. So as you know, we're joined again by Caroline McEnery, and for those of you who are not familiar with Caroline, she's a HR and employment law expert and former member of the Low Pay Commission, as well as been an active adjudication officer in the Workplace Relations Commission. Caroline comes to us with over 20 years industry experience from sectors including retail, food production, hospitality. So she really understands the challenges you're now facing and grappling with. But before I pass over to Caroline, let's have a look at the results of that first poll, Colette, if you don't mind. Okay, well, that's great to see and very positive that people have started that business forecasting and cash flow projections work, which is really critical to looking at and informing the staffing level requirements and looking at the whole HR organisational planning and restructuring. So without further ado, Caroline, I'm going to pass over to you today.
This webinar has been updated to incorporate some of the changes that have been announced in the government guidelines since this webinar was recorded. Thank you, Amanda. Good afternoon, everybody. Delighted to be back with you this morning. And this morning's session, I suppose we're going to start with some further clarifications from the last webinar that we did, which focused a lot in relation to the new employment subsidy scheme that was introduced on the 1st of September. And I suppose we flagged some concerns we had associated with the scheme, and also told you that Fudge Ireland were actively lobbying the government to try and address some of the concerns we had. One of those was in relation to the fact that you needed to be registered and also have your claim in for any staff members who were with you in July and August, that you could back pay this new subsidy for EWSS for them. And we're delighted that that now is extended till the 15th of September, and so you have a little bit more time to be registered and also to submit any of that back pay in relation to that and get the subsidy for those 2 months, which is really positive news. There was obviously a lot of concerns flagged in relation to the criteria around the reduction in turnover, and that unfortunately remains as it did when it was launched first. It's important to note that you need to be down 30% based on the 6 month cumulatively and in relation to the month you're applying versus last year. So that's an important criteria. And also there was queries in relation to clarification in relation to proprietary directors in terms of their eligibility for the EWSS. And again, there's further clarification being received from Revenue since then to confirm that the director must be on the payroll. They must have received wages between July 2019 and June 2020. And they must be choose, if they're involved in 2 companies, you can only make the claim for one. So you need to choose which company you're making the claim for. And that's all information that's available in the revenue updates. And you'll see at the end of your screen there that there's revenue contact details, but there's also revenue guidelines that we would have reminded you about in our last webinar that are updated on a frequent basis. And we expect a further update in relation to those to come in the coming weeks. So keep an eye on those. Whoever does your payroll should make sure that they're staying informed and on top of those. So in today's webinar, we're going to cover, I suppose, 3 key areas. Obviously, there's a lot of concern in the industry at the moment in relation to restructuring, in potential organisational redesign, and what that might mean for you and for your staff and your business. So today, even though redundancy, we want to be an absolute last resort, we're trying to give you as many thought processes to facilitate you as you're looking at your staffing levels and your business requirements for the coming months, identifying how best you might be able to plan for those. So we're looking at 3 stages. First, we're looking at the pre-planning stage. Then we're looking at the temporary restructuring, and then we're looking at the more longer term restructuring. And we'll cover those in lots of detail. And as Amanda said, you also have the opportunity to take advantage of the opportunity to ask any live questions that these points may indicate that you'd like to get further clarification on. So as in all elements of HR, pre-planning is crucial, and ensuring that you have a very good paper trail in HR is crucially important. And that paper trail, we say if it's not in paper, it never happened. And that paper trail can be an email, it can be, you know, whatever soft copy or hard copy that you feel is best in terms of communication. But it's really important that you keep that communication on file. If there was an issue at a later date, you're able to go back and address it. In relation to equality, that's something that comes up on an ongoing basis in terms of making sure that we adhere to fair selection criteria. And I'll remind you of that as this webinar continues during the course of the morning. So I suppose as we look at the pre-planning stage, the first element of what we need to look at is what exactly it is that you need from a business perspective. And based on the poll there, a lot of you have already started this process, which is very positive to see. And a lot of you will be working on that in the coming week or 2. So identifying what days and times will you open. Obviously, that may be influenced in relation to the subsidy scheme that we already addressed in the last webinar, which again you might like to revisit. It will be based on business requirements in terms of customer numbers and many other factors. As you do that, you're going to identify what skills are required to service what it is you now need going forward, and what levels of staff are going to be required as a result. And if you amend operational days of the week, how does this impact in terms of staff's availability? And it's really important that you take this opportunity to now check in with staff once you've identified the new business requirements in terms of their availability. Because for a lot of staff members, we're identifying their availability and needs have changed for varying life reasons, etc. So a good starting point would be to identify people's availability. I suppose it's really important that in this planning stage, you need to involve as many key stakeholders as you can. Close collaboration with your HR department within your business is the first port of call, or with your human resources consultants if applicable, because as you'll see from the course of this presentation, the detail of knowing you know, how to select, how to communicate, making sure you have the paper trail correct, etc., has never been more important. So that's really important that you get that legal basis to keep you on the straight and narrow. Close collaboration with your management team on the strategy is key, because you need their buy-in. We obviously need to talk to our staff. If you are a unionised business, you need to engage with your union or your staff representatives depending on the structure of your business. But the more engagement you do at that stage, the more buy-in you're going to get as a result. So a number of different areas can be considered depending on what's most suitable. And during the course of this webinar, I'm going to touch on as many of them as I can, again, just to give you alternatives and options. So the first area is in relation to the temporary restructuring, and starting with potentially reducing people's terms and conditions of employment. You may need to look at reducing pay. We can never reduce pay less than the national minimum wage. And again, I'm going to talk to you about how you might go about that if that is something you need to do. You may decide that you're going to pause hiring and instead look at the pool of people you have and see, can they modify the hours they have available to you? You're potentially going to reduce the reliance on contractors. So again, that you can spread the skill within the workforce that you have, or indeed, instead of recruiting somebody new to do certain shifts that you're stuck for, you might indeed actually use contractors for that purpose and still be in a position to give hours to the staff you have. Redeploying or reskilling employees, so within different departments. You may look at enforcing periods of annual leave. Remember, you need to give people 30 days notice of the requirement for them to take annual leave, and many businesses may consider enforcing periods of annual leave if people have a lot of annual leave built up at this stage. And there's nothing stopping you offering sabbaticals or unpaid leave to any staff members that may suit. So if we move on then, I suppose one of the challenges that has come up a lot for us in relation to COVID has been when you have work available for your staff, lots of them potentially due to childcare, when creches and childcare was closed, indicated that they weren't in a position to return. Alternatively, you have people and they may have underlying health conditions, they may be concerned in relation to vulnerable people in their household, etc. So there's a variety of reasons why employees may indicate to you that they're not in a position to return to work. But what's really important for you as an employer is if you have work available for your employees, layoff ceases at that stage. So once layoff ceases, it's important you communicate in writing to the employee to let them know, dear Caroline, I'd like to confirm we will have work available for you from X date. And it's important that at this stage you try and address any employees who may have been unavailable to return, for example, until schools returned, etc., to try and address that now. I suppose the pandemic unemployment payment is only designed when people are on layoff. So you're letting people know that you have work available for them, so they officially need to come off the PUP payment, and you explain that to them. You make sure, you look at options, alternative options that they may, if they still want to stay out, they might be looking at alternative forms of leave, or indeed medically they may be certified to be required to stay out for longer. And at that stage you may need to involve a company doctor. And throughout this entire process, it's crucial to remember your paper trail. So this is a complex area, and I mentioned paper trail and equality as something that underpins all of what I'm covering in today's webinar. And this couldn't be more important in this very important area. So tread carefully, ensure you communicate lots, ensure you do a paper trail, and ensure that you in no way discriminate against somebody due to any of those equality grounds, for example, due to disability, due to health, due to family status, due to age, etc. So keep that very carefully at the forefront of your mind when you're managing this area. So a very topical area at the moment that we're dealing with clients a lot is the whole area of restructuring terms and conditions of employment, which is a very tricky area from an employment law perspective. And as we're working with clients in this regard, the first protocol is to always look at the contractual entitlements that an employee has. And I'm using the example of salary, but you could pick any other terms and conditions, for example, working hours, place of work, etc. So the employees in their contract of employment have a contractual obligation to whatever you outlined in their contract of employment, or whatever indeed became custom and practice for them. And this can't be changed unilaterally. And ultimately, I suppose, when you look at changes to terms and conditions, the best way to make those changes is by mutual negotiation and agreement. And many businesses at the start of COVID are revisiting now again potential wage reductions or changes to terms. And the best approach is to make sure you do that transparently, you do that proactively, and you do that consultatively. And as you do that, you're trying to avoid the employee invoking their right to go to the Workplace Relations Commission and put in a claim because they feel you unilaterally changed their terms and conditions. It's important, your contracts of employment and your staff handbooks are probably your most important documents in relation to any agreement or document that you have with your employees, and they form the legal basis of that relationship. So ensuring that you have very robust, fit for purpose terms and conditions of employment and a really comprehensive handbook is crucial. And if it's something that you feel you have been meaning to get around to and haven't done, you've obviously updated your COVID policy. I would say it's a very good time to also review your contracts, your handbook, and your policies that are relevant to this whole area. So one contractual clause is in relation to the variation clause, and if you have new employees starting, you can incorporate this clause in. But if you have current employees that don't have this clause, you're not in a position to include it. So even if you have a variation clause or any other, I suppose, ability to unilaterally change terms and conditions needs to ideally be for a set period of time. And it's important that we flag that to the employee to say, look, we're asking for your agreement to take this wage reduction for the next 3 months and we'll review it again, or next 6 months and we'll review it then at that stage. So they're clear in relation to what they've signed up to and what they've agreed, and they understand the timeline that that period is for. So again, it's more likely that they will accept and agree to that rather than something indefinite in terms of time. Again, if they agree, it's really important that you get them to sign off and accept that, so there can't be any recourse at a later date in relation to that.
Caroline, sorry, Amanda here. Just before we move on there, just going to come in with a few questions that's coming through from our audience, because there's quite a lot in what you just covered there. A few people are asking, really, in terms of how you should approach and plan to approach the conversation with staff. If you're looking at, for example, moving them to short-time working, do you tackle it at an individual employee level, or do you look at it as employee groups? And it is right to propose and explain why some roles require this and others not, even if they're where there's going to be different approaches taken between employee A and employee B within the one business area or department. How do you determine best approach and fairness in that?
Okay, I would say I would be concerned based on the question, on the basis that you're saying that there's a different approach for employee B and a different approach for employee A. I suppose we're going to look at selection criteria, and whether we're looking at short time, whether we're looking for layoff, or we're looking at redundancy, that criteria needs to be objectively justified, is how the legislation terms it. And what that means is that it's nothing to do with anything other than the job and the business requirements. So I would say it's crucial to ensure, first of all, the criteria is objectively justified. In relation to the part of the question about do you communicate individually or at group level, that very much depends on the seriousness of the change. I always believe and would always advise that you start with the planning piece of saying, what is it that the business requires? What is it we need to do? And then you plan your strategy flowing from that. So if this change was, for example, that we're changing the opening hours of the business and we're now going to only be open Thursday, Friday, Saturday instead of the 7 days before, that might be something you communicate on a group basis. But if you were making changes to people's rosters within that, that would be something you would do individually. Because again, people will have different considerations and nuances. So for some person they might say, well, actually that suits me, Amanda, I'm happy with that. And for somebody else, they're saying, look, I really need another day financially to keep going. So again, somebody else might be in a position to facilitate that, depending, but you're not going to know that until you have those individual conversations. So I think we would always say, in a situation like short-time layoff or redundancy, or indeed in just the uncertain backdrop that we have at the moment, over communicate rather than less, so that people feel listened to and they feel heard, both from a group perspective and an individual basis.
Okay, and Caroline, just to that employee A and employee B scenario, I mean, if you've got a situation now where you're going to remain, for example, open for 5 days out of the 7, but you recognize that you've, for example, maybe, 5 staff on breakfast, but in actual fact, you're going to only now require 2 staff full-time and, the others part-time, but the roles they're in is the same, what's the best approach there then?
I suppose based on just the element of having a conversation with each of them to see what suits them first. And that's why we were saying that it would be good to get what is people's availability like now, because we're finding that for some people, they actually are saying, look, I'm happy with the part-time, that suits me fine now. And for more, they want more hours. So without talking to all of those 5 people first, it's very hard to decide what's the fairest thing to do in line with business requirements. But I would also say then you need to take if you're eligible for the EWSS scheme, you need to take that into account, because each of those 5 people's wages will be subsidized potentially if they all work part-time. So I think that's why when you're doing this, you need to layer the last webinar we covered on top of this, and do your business strategy accordingly, because that's for you trying to maximize your staffing and resourcing plan in line with your business requirements, and to do that as financially beneficial as you can to the business also.
Okay, and a question related to that then, if an employer refuses to accept a reduction in pay or hours, is the employer entitled to place the employee on temporary redundancy?
There is no such thing as temporary redundancy is the first thing.
That's what I was wondering actually, yeah.
And you can't, I suppose, you'll see as we go through the webinar today, there's no, redundancy is final. Redundancy is a termination of employment. So if you put an employee on short time, if you put an employee on layoff, etc., they're short-term measures. Layoff can be for a long period of time, but they're short-term. But if you make somebody redundant, you've effectively terminated their employment. So that's a very serious thing to do, and you need to make sure that you've done it based on objectively justified criteria. And somebody not accepting a reduction in wages isn't a good reason for that. So
okay,
again,
well, with that, in light of that, then. Great. In light of that, Caroline, I'll let you proceed then to look at the short-term and longer-term measures. Thanks.
I suppose the key areas for us to look at are, how do we maintain as many staff on the books? How do we maximise the potential subsidy that's available? And how do you meet your business requirements? And in doing so, I suppose, maintain the morale of your staff also. So there's 3 options available. So the first one is short time. The next one is layoff, and the final one is redundancy. And redundancy really should only be in a last resort that we look at redundancy. Short time and layoff are the most typical ones for organisations to look at the moment. And I'm going to take you through those in a bit more detail, and let's okay, so the first area is short-time working. And short time you will be familiar with from the fact that during COVID, we had to put people on short time when businesses closed, and some employees would have been on reduced hours. And for example, you were operating in terms of takeaway. So that would have been short time. So instead of working full time as they were, they might be working 3 days a week, for example, or 2 days a week instead of their full-time hours. So that's reduced hours, and you have the option to reduce somebody's hours in line with your business requirements in that regard. I suppose there's no definition in employment law in terms of how long you can put somebody on short time or how long you can put somebody on layoff in terms of that temporary approach versus that long approach. So you need to, I suppose, continue to engage with and keep your employees up to date in relation to deciding that. I suppose the more longer term restructuring then, and layoff can be short term in terms of a number of weeks, it can be a number of months. Layoff is when the business is actually closed. So we have included it both as a short-term measure and as a long-term measure. And there's also the other measures that I'm going to look at, which involve redundancy, considering outsourcing potentially. So you may outsource some of your tasks, you may look at restructuring, or you may look at redeployment. And you may also look at early retirement, which is one you need to tread very sensitively with, because as you know, there's no retirement age in Ireland. So if we are encouraging somebody to consider early retirement, we need to make sure we're doing that very sensitively in line with equality legislation. So in terms of layoff, I suppose what layoff means is that there's a period of time that the business will be closed or you have no work available for an employee. So for example, there may be different departments within your business, or indeed the entire business, that may be closed, and as a result, that position is going to be put on layoff. And we always talk about the position, not the person. So when we talk about putting people on, for example, layoff, we always talk about the position, not the person, because it's not you're choosing Caroline over Amanda. It's the fact that they both do the same job, and as a result, the positions are going to be put on layoff. There should be a contractual provision in your contract to do so. Alternatively, you should have your custom and practice in the organisation, but that's why it's a very opportune time to review your contracts to ensure all these important clauses are going to be in it. You must ensure that you have tried to look at all other options. So, you know, we start with short time, then we move to layoff, then we move to redundancy. You can't just go straight to redundancy or straight to layoff. You must look at as many options as you can to show that you're communicating and engaging with your employees. I suppose there's no time frame, as I mentioned, in terms of you know, how long somebody can be on notice in terms of the notice you need to give them, etc. But you are going to try, if you're planning, for example, to close the business for October, November, December, you're communicating that as soon as you have made that decision. Layoff means that there's no work, whereas short time means there's reduced hours, and it's important to remember the difference between them in that regard. The employees at the moment have the option to invoke redundancy if they are going to be on layoff for more than 4 weeks or for 6 weeks in the last 13 weeks. So that option is finished. The legislation was paused until the 17th of September, and we're hoping, and there's a lot of lobbying going on, that that will be extended, but we have to wait and see if that happens.
In relation to the redundancy option for employees to request redundancy, since we recorded this webinar, this scheme is now paused until the 30th of November 2020.
I suppose that's a big concern, because you then could have long-term serving employees who request and invoke redundancy if they're entitled to avail of that provision. So for employees who were on layoff, I suppose it's really important that you consider that that provision is going to come in on the 17th of September. So again, you need to, at this stage, hopefully have your plan in place as to how you're going to address that, so you don't get a tranche of redundancy requests coming in, which potentially from a cash flow perspective could be challenging for you. So I'm going to pass you back over to Amanda now, who's going to do the next poll with you.
Thank you, Caroline. The question here, folks, is what restructuring options are you considering for staff to put in place over the coming 6 to 8 weeks? And really, they're options that might be invoked by the employee or employer for you to consider. So just to get a sense there of the mix of options that you're looking at. And while we wait the results of those polls, Caroline, another audience question here. What are the options and what's likely to happen if your employer proposals on short time or layoff or revised contract terms and conditions are not accepted by the employee? And I suppose a related question to it, how do you protect against claims for constructive dismissal if moving some jobs to short time or part time? Caroline.
So I think how you protect against the constructive dismissal is to ensure that you're showing objectively how you made that selection. So in other words, you've done it based on job role, you've done it based on department needs, you've done it based on skills. So they're all valid reasons that you can stand over and, you know, prevent that. So, and that's really important to be able to keep that paper trail. So if somebody does come back at a later date to say, look, I feel I was unfairly selected for short time, for layoff, or constructive dismissal, they would fall into that category, or indeed redundancy, which would be an unfair dismissal. So layoff and short time would be linked more to constructive dismissal, where the employee feels they had to leave because they were unfairly treated, which is quite the burden of proof is on the employee in that regard to prove. Whereas if you unfairly select somebody for redundancy, it's unfair dismissal because you made a termination of employment.
Okay, and another question then, what is your advice on bonuses and expenses owed before lockdown? Can employers seek to restructure bonuses if they have not achievable due to COVID? Caroline, before you answer this, I assume any bonuses achieved pre-lockdown must be paid. However, could you request or negotiate with an employee to defer that payment until you're in a better financial position to pay it? What's your views on that?
So I suppose there's two elements to that question. One is what you have to do about bonuses that have already been earned and are due to the employee. And ultimately, we'd be going back to what does it say in the contractual clause to make it clear what was the agreement in place in relation to achieving those criteria. If the person has met that criteria, then they're entitled to get that. In terms of the changes going forward, it's the piece we covered off there just before the poll in relation to negotiating changes. You can't make a unilateral change, but you need to look and see what change you may be in a position to do. And there's a very good case law case which gives us very good indication and guidance, which is the B&Q case in relation to advising employers how they would handle changing bonuses going forward, and again highlights the importance of those contractual clauses in your contracts of employment and in your agreements with staff in relation to those kind of things. So again, great lessons, so that again it might encourage us to review our contracts, review our policies, review our handbook.
Great, Caroline. So Colette, can we have the results of that second poll there, please? Okay, well, that's really good to see that people are looking at a multiple of options there, and that the default is really not looking at redundancy. And it's great to see such a strong indication of short-time working being one of the preferred options, because for us as an industry, I think that is one of the safest ways for us to ensure that the skills we have in the industry remain within the industry, and that the skills remain as current as possible, because people have still access to work, albeit on a shorter basis. So Caroline, back over to you now.
So I suppose redundancy, as that poll has highlighted, is hopefully going to be a last resort, and people will go with the other options. And I suppose the concern around redundancy is that the employee and the employer will have the option after the 17th of September, unless that legislation is going to change. So hopefully the lobbying around that will help. So a lot of the questions that have been coming in has been, how do you protect yourself as an employer in relation to claims for constructive dismissal, unfair selection, etc. One key way of doing that is to focus on the position, not the person. And that's really important when you're looking at redundancy, which is termination, but also when you're looking at any of the other areas. And here are some of the unfair selection criteria, which often come up to say, well, I feel I've been unfairly selected because somebody didn't like me, because it was a personality clash, because it was performance related, age related, etc. So these are reasons you cannot use. And if the employee challenges them, you need to be able to go back and show, no, it had nothing to do with that. These were the criteria that we used. The important thing about when you're making somebody redundant is the notice period that you have to give them depends on the length of service they have with you, or any other conditional contractual agreements you have in their contract of employment. It's important to remember that if somebody has been on layoff or on short time, their contract has been suspended during that period of time. So you must give them their full notice period, and also they're entitled to any holidays or payment in lieu of holidays if that is the case. So if you aren't in a position to pay the redundancy payment, which is statutory 2 weeks per year of service plus a bonus week. So if you have an employee with you 5 years, for example, they will get 11 weeks wages plus whatever notice they're entitled to, plus any annual leave that they've accrued. So if you're not in a position to pay that redundancy amount, you complete and submit the RP50 form online, print a copy for the employee, and both the employer and employee sign it, and then that form goes to the redundancy and insolvency section of the DASP, and you need to have backup with that to show your accounts, etc., to show you're not in a position to facilitate that. So people are eligible for redundancy if they're age 16 or over. They also need to have 2 years continuous service of 104 weeks, and breaks in service like maternity leave, parental leave, etc., are not considered to be a break in service. So that counts during that period of time. And this was the area that Amanda already asked, which was, what if somebody comes back and says, you didn't, I feel unfairly dismissed because you didn't meet my criteria. And that's important that you avoid that at all costs. So again, the consultation period is a requirement to ensure that you're doing your consultation with your employees. And during that period of time, especially for collective redundancy, it's really important to ensure no redundancy occurs during that time. So the employee requesting redundancy is going to be invoked from the 17th of September.
In relation to the redundancy option for employees to request redundancy, since we recorded this webinar, this scheme is now paused until the 30th of November 2020.
What that means is that if an employee is on layoff or short time for 4 weeks or more, or up to 6 weeks in the last 13 weeks, they have the right to request redundancy, which had been paused. And then if that is no longer paused, you will have to make a provision for that in terms of how it potentially will happen. So the employee then gives you notice to say that they want to be made redundant. You offer them a counter if that is applicable for you, and you guarantee that you'll have 13 weeks unbroken employment for them. You need to go back to them immediately within 7 days to give them that counter offer. And if you don't give them that counter offer, then basically they're entitled to get their redundancy. So that's something that we need to make sure that we're planning for in case that occurs. In relation to the redundancy itself, it's important we do that consultation process, and that starts with doing your business case in terms of identifying, so why are we engaging with discussions in relation to redundancy? And for most people that will be related to the business, to either departments closing, etc. The next important area is to look at the selection criteria. And as we mentioned, you need to show what criteria you've used. So for example, it might be the department, everybody in that department is going to be made redundant. You might be asking people, are they willing to redeploy into other areas? You might be identifying specific skills that you still need to retain. So generally the selection criteria is consulted with in terms of the employees to let them know what that looks like. Then you would do a meeting with the employees, either individually or collectively, depending on the number and the circumstances. You would do a follow-up in relation to the meeting, and you would then listen to the feedback from the employees, either collectively or individually, and you need to show you've considered that. And by doing that, you go back to them at the next meeting to show, okay, we've considered the suggestions that you've highlighted. So oftentimes we've had scenarios where employees come back and say, look, everybody's willing to take a pay reduction. People are willing to just work minimal hours so that we can keep everybody on to avoid the redundancies. So you need to show that you've taken those into consideration, and if those are reasonable suggestions, you would try and go with those. If they're not, you would follow on with meeting 2 to talk about the next steps in relation to the redundancy, and then proceed to issue your notice. I suppose the appropriate timeline is generally that 30 days in terms of timeline, but it's important to show that you've given it due consideration. So you wouldn't just be meeting people and not giving consideration to any of the counter proposals. And these are just some examples of what that counter proposals may look like. Collective redundancy is obviously when you're looking at larger numbers of employees, and during that consultation period of 30 days, you need to make sure that we're consulting with employees. So if the numbers are within these categories, you've got a collective redundancy. So if you have a workforce of up to 49, if you make more than 5 people redundant, a workforce of up to 99, 10 people, and up to 299, 10%, or 30 employees where there's 300 or more employed. And then you must enter consultation with a view to reaching agreement, and you must also make sure that you don't give anybody notice of redundancy within that 30-day consultation period. I suppose it's your obligation then to outline the reasons for the redundancies, the numbers, the description of who is employed, the period, the criteria, and the method for calculating that redundancy payment. And you need to do that and communicate it with the minister at least 30 days before you make the first person redundant. So that's quite a serious obligation on an employer to do. And as I say, we're hoping that that's a last resort, and based on the poll, we're hoping that redundancy will not be something that most of you will need to go down the road of, but if you do, it's important that you know the obligations, and again that's taking you through the consultation process there. So I'm going to hand you back over to Amanda to do our next poll, which is just on your screens there now.
Thanks, Caroline. So just looking at the poll, can we just invite you to answer the question, what percentage of your employees do you anticipate will face redundancy in the coming 4 to 6 weeks? And I suppose that is redundancy that would be evoked by the employer or employee, given that the pausing of that opportunity to invoke redundancy is due to actually finish on the 17th of September. But as
in relation to the redundancy option for employees to request redundancy, since we recorded this webinar, this scheme is now paused until the 30th of November 2020.
Caroline indicated, we are lobbying, as are many others in the industry, lobbying very hard for that to be extended to try to avoid that. So while we have the poll there being conducted, just a few questions that have come in, Caroline. One that I just need to offer clarification on myself. Just the whole question around the sweep back opportunity, the CSV file for revenue, to basically claim back for seasonal workers and new recruits employed from July and August. We have had an indication from revenue that that documentation and application process and that file will be available this week on revenue. We had hoped that we would see it ahead of this morning's webinar. It's not in yet, but they did say early in this week, so please do keep an eye out for that. We would expect it hopefully either today or tomorrow. That's the latest indication revenue have been giving us on that. And then just, Caroline, a question that has come in here. If you need to make an employee on layoff redundant, do you need to bring them back to work to unpause their contract in order to do that?
Officially, you do is the answer, but because you will also have to, decide what you're going to do with any outstanding annual leave, etc. But remember, your aim is to avoid the redundancy in the first place. So as you're doing the consultation process, you may bring the employee back on the payroll, but if you don't have work for them, you might be letting them work at home if that's feasible, or you just bring them back on the payroll for the time they're spending doing the meetings with you. Because there's no point bringing somebody in if there's no job for them or if the business is closed, for example. But your aim has to be to show that you've tried to avoid the redundancy. So again, you'd like to understand more as to why that person is still out. So for example, if that person was out due to a medical condition that they hadn't returned, again, you would just need to tread carefully so the person wouldn't say, look, I feel I was only made redundant because I had a disability or because I was out sick, etc. So I think just digging a little bit deeper into the rationale for that is important, but I would definitely say tread carefully.
Great. And then another question here. We have a department that looks like it will have no work officially for a year at least, and we're considering making the team redundant. But what happens if bookings reignite after the 12 months? Is it a straightforward process to hire new people, or should you go back to those that effectively have made redundant? I think you've indicated already that redundancy is final. So are you free then to look at new recruits if circumstances changed after the 12 months?
So if you have a 12-month period, 12 months to me, enough time has elapsed. But if it was any shorter than that, in terms of, so for example, if you were looking at closing until Christmas and potentially opening up again in January, one would argue that that should be layoff, not redundancy. So this, it's important to ensure that redundancy is a last resort. So again, for some employees, if you're regionally located in somewhere very, off the beaten track from an employment perspective, they may feel, well, I'm happy to wait 6 months for the role, whereas in another location, the employee would want their redundancy so they can find alternative employment.
Okay, and in a question related to that, and there's two questions actually. One is there any indication that the PUP payment will be extended? I think we've got clarity that that's not expected. Isn't that right, Caroline?
In relation to the PUP payment, this is now being extended until the 1st of April 2021, and applications will be accepted up till the end of 2020. This is the most recent information we have in relation to this scheme, which has been updated since we recorded this webinar.
That's right. So the previous webinar we've done, which you can go back and view on the Fáilte Ireland website, clarifies in relation to the PUP in quite a lot of detail. So if you don't have employees already registered by the 17th of September on the PUP, then you can't register new people after that date. But if you register them now, they will remain on the PUP. So that's, again, a consideration now for you when you're doing this forecasting and planning to take into account.
Great, okay. So just while we're getting the results of that last poll, Caroline, just one more here. If an employee has less than 2 years service in March when placed on temporary layoff, but the 2 years have now passed since they were on layoff, are they entitled to redundancy?
So their start date is what's taken into account, and if the layoff is temporary, that start date doesn't break their service. but there's a redundancy calculator available, and you can literally just put in the employee start dates, including their break of service, because for some employees, their break of service will be to do with maternity, parental leave, layoff, illness, etc. And they may have had a couple of breaks in service since they started with you. So that's a very good, easy way to explain it to your employee when you're giving them the detail in relation to their entitlements. So I think that would be a very good way to communicate that to your employees.
Okay, thanks, Caroline. We will take the results of that poll, I think. Okay, so from that, we can thankfully see that the majority are looking at less than 10% of their employees moving towards redundancy, but there are some businesses, obviously, given the nature of the business, that they are looking at considerable amounts of their staff being made redundant. So, Caroline, just to follow on from that poll.
Yeah, Amanda, thank you. So sometimes you may look at an ex gratia waiver, and that basically means that you're giving the employee an additional payment above statutory. And again, that's a legally binding document that you're asking the employee to sign if they accept that waiver. So I'm going to pass you back to Amanda to do poll number 4, and then we'll just cover the final few points.
Thank you, Caroline. So just in terms of the final poll then for today, can we just ask for those of you who are looking at staff being made redundant, have you at this point calculated the expected redundancy costs in order to look at your needs in regard to cash flow around that? And Caroline, while we actually just take the results of that poll and gather them, just a few more questions here that has come in. Can international employees on visa stamp 2 go on short time? I don't believe they have any entitlement to social welfare payment.
So again, I suppose you're going to objectively look at what is your business requirements and what commitment you've given to those students, because for some you've contractually agreed to give them X many hours to meet their visa requirements. So again, that's a different criteria to somebody who might be just working and looking for it to top up, for example, the fact that they're maybe here to study another language and it's just a part-time job to them. So I think we have to treat both differently in terms of how we address that. But ultimately, your business requirements are going to dictate what you do in that regard. And it will be tough decisions for some people in relation to availability for work in that regard.
Great. And Caroline, one final question then, and the others I'm afraid we'll have to actually add to our FAQs after this webinar, is it 2 years that an employee can bring a claim for unfair dismissal due to perceived unfair selection for redundancy?
So it's 6 months initially, and that can be extended for up to 12 months if the person can show the adjudicator that they have reasonable cause as to why that's extended. So that will depend in relation to that criteria.
Great. And then just one final thing, individual redundancy and the requirement for consultation. Somebody was recently advised that the 30-day consultation period is not mandatory if agreement is reached. Can you clarify that, Caroline?
So in relation to the collective redundancy, 30 days is the requirement in the legislation. Obviously, if you reach agreement, the risk of an employee taking a claim is gone because they've reached agreement to say we've waived that. So in employment law, you can't waiver your statutory rights. So whether that's organisational working time or any others for that matter. But ultimately, if people are represented or people have signed an agreement in relation to agreeing something different to what is the statutory requirement, I would say it's really important that that's very well documented, that's agreed, etc., because again, it's the risk of that person taking a claim afterwards that you're able to say, look, they did it in the knowledge that they were making a variation in relation to what their rights were, and we asked them to get advice and they still agreed to it and accepted it, etc. So you'd have to very much have your paper trail in place. And again, you're making a business decision there as to whether you decide to waiver that or not.
Great, thanks, Caroline. So we'll share with you now the results of the final poll, and there's still a number of people got to do that calculation to look at how it affects cash flow. And I suppose some people are probably holding out with fingers crossed that maybe the pause to invoke redundancy option deadline of the 17th September changes.
In relation to the redundancy option for employees to request redundancy, since we recorded this webinar, this scheme is now paused until the 30th of November 2020.
But nevertheless, we would encourage you to kind of move with that need to actually look at the implications of that on your cash flow, because obviously that will affect your business operations and decisions around that. So just to finally, to finish up from that, if we can actually just move to the checklist slide, please, Colette, thank you. We've just provided there with a kind of a suggestion of what really you need to look at starting to do now. So there's the short-term forecasting, and obviously then there is a longer-term forecast need to look at to bring you up to the next 6 months, and then make sure that any selection criteria for either layoff, short time or redundancy is clearly mapped out and communicated with your staff. Also the opportunity there to consider an ex gratia payment and sign a waiver if that is the way that the staff termination of employment is chosen as the preferred option, and also to make sure that you have your reference templates ready for those staff who will be possibly moving to depart your organisation. It just leaves me to say a huge thank you to everybody today, to thank you for joining us with me today. Just to say to you that if you are still having issues or concerns around organisational restructuring programmes over the coming weeks, please be reminded that you just need to reach out to your local Fudge Ireland representative if you need to request any additional support, guidance or clarification around this. They're there to help you, and we will have some HR expert guidance on standby for you if you need that. So for me, just running 2 minutes over from today, so thank you very much for your patience and staying with us. Have a good day, everyone. Take care.